So good morning, everyone. Once again, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your time this morning. My name is Michaela Stone. I'm a legislative analyst here at CSAC, working in the Administration of Justice portfolio alongside my colleague, Ryan Moramuni, who is also here with us today. We hope to see you in subsequent webinars on this topic. For your reference, the next webinar will be on Wednesday, March 26th from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. And before I continue, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Supervisor Luis Alejo. Supervisor Alejo, take it away.
Good morning. Buenos dias, everybody. I want to thank Michaela and Ryan for your work. I am your second vice president of the California State Association of Counties, Luis Alejo, and I want to thank CSAC and our amazing staff for organizing this three-part webinar series on the important topic of immigration. I think this may be a first for CSAC. Last week, so many of us attended the National Association of Counties Legislative Conference in Washington, D.C., and NACO also held a workshop on this important topic of immigration. And guess what? It had over 500 people in attendance. It was the most attended workshop that week. And so we know that this is a big topic of interest for so many county supervisors and staff from all over our nation. I believe these CSAC webinars will be helpful for our counties in a state like California, where over 27% of our residents are foreign-born and where we have the largest population of undocumented residents out of any state in the country. Furthermore, thousands of our households in our respective counties are of mixed status, where you may find citizens, lawful permanent residents, DACA recipients, and undocumented all under the same roof. We also know that there will likely be many impacts to our core county services like Medi-Cal, CalFresh, and CalWorks, or to our hospitals and our clinics. We also expect impacts on our largest workforces, such as agriculture, hospitality, construction, childcare, and other industries and professions that highly depend on immigrant labor. We recently saw just that in Kern County at the height of the citrus harvest that came to a halt. Lastly, I want to thank our expert speakers who have joined us today from the Pew Research Center and my friend and former dean of my law school, Professor Kevin Johnson of UC Davis School of Law. Colleagues, lastly, I will also hope that you will join the other two webinars after today and that you could encourage your colleagues and staff to RSVP who may find this information useful to understanding the complex issue of immigration and what counties can expect and prepare for this coming year. With that, I'll pass the mic back to Michaela, and thank you for having me here today.
Supervisor Alejo. So yes, following up on that, in recognition of CSAC's diversity, we are hosting these webinars as an informational resource to all counties, particularly in an environment of uncertainty on this front. And so before we begin, I just would like to make note of a few general housekeeping reminders for our attendees. The first of which is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all attendees and registrants. So even if you weren't able to attend this live session, you will be able to view the recording. And then secondly, you are welcome to direct any questions or comments to staff via the chat or the Q&A, and we will be providing a summary of what was discussed today after the meeting to attendees. So I would like to now introduce our esteemed speakers. We have Jens Krogstad from the Pew Research Center and Professor Kevin Johnson from the UC Davis School of Law. Jens is a senior writer and editor at the center and has authored and edited hundreds of studies on topics that include global migration, Latino public opinion, and Hispanic demographic trends, and much more. Prior to joining the center, he spent time as a reporter in organizations such as USA Today. We also have Professor Johnson joining us from the UC Davis School of Law. He is a distinguished professor of law and maybe Apallas professor of public interest law and a Martin Luther King Jr. professor of law, as well as having an appointment as a professor of Chicana studies. After joining the faculty in 1989, he was named the Associate Dean in 1998 and served as Dean from 2008 and 2024. He's a regular fixture on the national and international circuit in discussing this important topic. So now to our first presenter, Jens, you are welcome to take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm in DC, based in DC, and I know that it is quite a bit earlier out there in California. So good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of trends we're seeing in U.S. immigration. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the long and rich history of immigration to the United States, with a fairly detailed look at immigration to various states in the country, including California. Then I'll I'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of the immigrant population, and I'll end with talking a little bit about California in particular, about um, interstate migration and reasons for outmigration. Before I jump into that, a quick note about the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center is a nonprofit fact tank, and we study attitudes and trends that shape the world. We're nonpartisan and non-advocacy, so you'll see during this presentation that I'm sticking strictly to the facts, and in this presentation, we'll be covering a lot of information that's based on census data from the US Census Bureau. Okay, so to start, I thought we could cover a broad sweep of US immigration history. And the US Census Bureau has been collecting data on immigration to the US for more than 100 years. And here you can see, we can start from the beginning. In the 1800s, we saw that there was a fairly large immigrant population in the US. It reached a peak of immigrant population reaching 15% of the total national population in around 1890. So so during that time, for a few decades, the population of the US was made up of about 15% immigrant. And for decades after that, going into the 1920s, 30s, and until 1965 or so, we saw the share of the US immigrant population decline fairly steadily. And there was a big event that happened in 1965. Congress passed passed a new immigration law that opened up immigration to all over the world, especially from Latin America and Asia. Previously, immigration was more restricted, and immigration came primarily from Europe. And so starting in 1965 and the decades after that, we saw a large influx of immigration. About half of all immigrants from 1965 to 2023 are from Latin America. Immigration and that immigration from Latin America was primarily from Mexico. Today, we see that immigration has reached its historic peak. We're again around 15% of the US population being made up of immigrants. And so for these next few slides, I will walk through how the immigrant population has changed over the decades, over the centuries in the US. And what you see here is the largest immigrant population in each state. So in 1860, the largest immigrant population in California was from China. Nationally, the largest immigrant population was from Ireland, and then next was Germany. And at that time, the total US population was around 31 million, and the total foreign-born population was around 4 million. And so the immigrant population was around 13%. And so fast forward to 1920, and you see that the characteristics, the origins of immigrants coming to the US has changed. In California, the largest immigrant origin group is from Italy. And by that time, Italy was the second largest foreign-born population, the second largest foreign-born country of origin, with about 1.6 million people nationally. And at this time, the immigrant population was still around 13% of the total national population. Okay, so let's jump ahead to 1960. So right before Congress passed its new immigration law in 1965, at that time, we saw a change in the immigrant population. You can see in the Southwest, including in California, now the largest immigrant population, immigrant origin population was from Mexico. But nationally, the largest foreign-born country of origin was Italy at about 1.3 million. Now, by this time, the total US population had reached about 179 million, and the total immigrant population was nearly 10 million. And note that the share of the foreign-born population by 1960 was had dropped to 5%. So back in 1920, the immigrant population was about 13% of the national total. And over the next 4 decades, it dropped down to 5%. But by 1980, we saw that the immigrant population had started to grow. It had grown from about 10 million in 1960 to about 14 million in 1980. Immigrants were now about 6% of the population. By 1980, the largest country of origin among immigrants was Mexico at about 2 million. And so we're starting to see the immigrant population take on more of the characteristics that we see today. Okay, and so by 2000, you can really see clearly the impact of this historic wave of immigration from Mexico. You can see in the majority of states in the US, the largest country of origin among immigrants was Mexico, including in California. The immigrant population, the immigrant Mexican origin population had reached 9 million by 2000. The immigrant population overall had reached 31 million, about 31 million, and the immigrant share of the national population had increased to 11%. And so it had gone from about 13% in 1920, had dropped down to around 5% in 1960, and had since then climbed to 11%, around 11% in 2000. And now, just a few years ago in 2020, so essentially present day, you can see that the Mexican immigrant population has continued to grow, although it did slow down starting around the Great Recession in 2008. The immigrant population from Mexico had reached nearly 11 million by 2022. The total national immigrant population had reached about 46 million, and the percent foreign-born of the national population had reached just about 14%. Okay, so that was a look at the broad sweep of history of the immigrant population in the US with a focus on state origins, the origins by state. And so now let's pull back to present day. This is from 2022, and let's look at the top birthplaces for US immigrants nationally. Mexico is by a pretty wide margin the largest country of origin for immigrants at nearly 11 million. And that makes up nearly 1 in 4 of all immigrants. So immigrants from Mexico make up about 1 in 4 of all US immigrants. The next largest are India, China, Philippines, and El Salvador. And the immigrant population in the US, this looks at the legal status of immigrants in the US. And you can see that the clear majority of immigrants in the US are what we call lawful immigrants. They are either naturalized citizens, lawful permanent residents, immigrants who hold green cards, or temporary lawful residents. And those are immigrants generally who have, for example, work visas. Interestingly, about half of all immigrants in the US are naturalized citizens. So they're immigrants who came to the country and became US citizens. And then also that leaves the unauthorized immigrant population or undocumented immigrant population. And our 2022 estimates, and this is estimates from the Pew Research Center, based on Census Bureau data, we put the population in 2022 at about 11 million. So a little under 1 in 4 immigrants in the US in 2022 were unauthorized immigrants. And so I'd mentioned that it was about 2 million immigrants in the US who were here on a temporary visa. And this is a look at temporary employment visas in 2023 nationally. And so you can see the two largest groups of employment visas are H-1B visas for high-skilled workers and H-2A visas for agriculture agricultural workers. In 2023, each of those, there were over 700,000 visas issued for each of those groups. There were smaller numbers issued for family members of H visa holders as well. And one other thing I wanted to note, some of the trends from pre-pandemic to today. In 2019, the US issued about 600,000 H-1B visas and 443 H-2A visas. So the number of visas issued to high-skilled workers and agricultural workers had bounced back from a decline during the pandemic and has actually now exceeded pre-pandemic totals. Now let's look at the immigrant population that holds a green card, and these are U.S. lawful permanent residents. And this is a look at U.S. lawful permanent residents from 2007 to 2023. The largest group of green card holders are those with family sponsored visas. It was about 756,000 in 2023. The next largest were green card holders, employment-based lawful permanent residents, and at nearly 200,000 in 2023. Smaller groups were refugees, those who arrived as refugees, and also those who hold diversity visas. A quick note on the trend here is you can see that the pandemic had a big impact on immigrant arrivals overall. Immigration to the US dropped dramatically during the pandemic, and that impacted temporary visas and also green card admissions during that time. But since then, I guess for the 4 years since then, we've seen that those totals for green card admissions has bounced back to pre-pandemic totals, just like we saw for temporary visas. I also wanted to walk through some of the educational attainment characteristics of immigrants overall, and also break down educational attainment among immigrants from different parts of the world, because there are some interesting trends there to highlight. And so one thing to note between US-born adults and foreign-born or immigrant adults, you can see that the US-born are more likely to have attended college than the immigrant population. However, the US-born and immigrant adults are about as likely to have a bachelor's degree or more. They're both at 35-36%. Now, those totals among immigrants doesn't hide some pretty big differences we see by origins. So, for example, immigrants from Mexico, about half have less than a high school education, and it's about a little less than a quarter have attended college. And we see similar trends for immigrants from Central America. By comparison, immigrants from different parts of Asia have higher educational attainment. About half or more have a bachelor's degree or more. And we see immigrants from Europe and other parts of North America, about half have a bachelor's degree or more. And finally, I wanted to highlight some of the trends among immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. And so immigrants from those regions of the world, we see relatively high educational attainment. We see that immigrants from those regions, about half or more, roughly half or more, have a bachelor's degree or more. So you can see there's a wide variation in educational attainment among immigrants depending on what part of the country they're from. Next, I wanted to cover some of the geographic characteristics of the immigrant population. This map shows the 20 US metro areas with the largest number of immigrants in 2022. As you can see, a lot of the metro areas in the top 20 are in California. That reflects the fact that California has the nation's largest immigrant population. In 2022, it had reached about 10 million and accounted for nearly a quarter of all immigrants in the US. The next largest state was, in terms of immigrant population, was Texas at about 5 million, and Florida at just under 5 million, and also New York at a little under 5 million. And so this really highlights the fact that California is really plays an important role in the immigrant population and the immigrant story of the US overall. And here is just, it's a more of a detailed look. It's a table version of the map that you saw on the previous slide. And you can see exactly which the metro areas are in the top 20 in the country, and what the immigrant population in each of those metro areas are. So Los Angeles, of course, has the largest immigrant population in California. This is the Los Angeles metro area at over 4 million. And then you also have the San Francisco and Riverside metro areas at over 1 million. San Jose and San Diego metro areas at around 800,000 roughly. And the Sacramento metro area makes the top 20 at a little under 500,000 immigrant population. And finally, I wanted to just briefly touch on some of the trends you can pull from census data based that look at interstate migration and the reasons for that migration. Now, the Pew Research Center generally focuses on national level analysis, so we hadn't done an analysis of California in particular. However, PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, does a lot of great work, and they had done this analysis. This particular data is from the California Department of Finance estimates, and there's a link here to the original report from PPIC, but it's a really great summary of net migration between California and other US states going back 24 years. And so in 2024, just last year, there was net outmigration of nearly 200,000 people out of California. So there were 200,000 more people who, overall, 200,000 more people left California than came into California in that year. And we've seen net outmigration from California every year since 2021. In 2000, there was net positive migration, net in-migration of about 154,000. But that was the last year that you saw net in-migration into California. And finally, this analysis from PPIC is based on current population survey, and that's from the Census Bureau. And it asks people who move out of California, why did they move out of California? And you can see from 2014 to 2024, by far the most common reason people gave was housing. 741,000 people who left California from 2014 to 2024 said housing was the reason they left California. That is a pretty big difference from the previous decade, from 2003 to 2013, when the most common reasons given were job and family. And that is the end of my slides. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm gonna hand it back to Michaela.
That was wonderful. We appreciate it. All right, next, without further delay, we will hear from our second speaker, Professor Johnson. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And I want to thank the California State Association of Counties for allowing me to talk with you today. And I'm quite proud that one of the people introducing us was Supervisor Luis Alejo, who was one of my former students at UC Davis School of Law. I'm very happy to hear from Jens about the hard work and good work of the Pew Research Center, which is my go-to when it comes to getting data on immigration to the United States. I'm going to outline a little bit the legal landscape that's facing us today, and it's a complicated one, and I apologize for that. I find, and I've been studying immigration for a number of years, I find the issue to be very complicated and not necessarily easy to characterize as a liberal versus conservative or red state versus blue state. Historically, the various parties have been all over the board on immigration, have taken different positions on immigration over time, and it's hard to characterize it as a liberal conservative issue. Now, it is clear, and it's important to all of us to be aware, and it's hard not to be, that President Trump has placed immigration high on his agenda of issues to address in his second term. He's made immigration and immigration enforcement a very high priority issue. He's made it such a high priority issue that it's ascended to the top of the list of issues, unlike any other modern president. He's advocated, as you've no doubt heard, a mass deportation campaign. He's appointed a border czar, Tom Homan, who's the former director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who's overseeing the enforcement and deportation campaign. But besides desiring to increase deportations, the administration has pledged to reduce legal immigration to the United States, to limit the number of visas being issued, to limit various forms of access to the United States, including some I'll talk about it a little bit, temporary protected status and refugee admissions. Now, the president has talked in ways unlike any other modern president when it comes to immigration. I don't think many would dispute that. He's talked about the dangers of immigration to the national security. He's complained and said that immigrants take jobs from U.S. citizens and overconsume public benefits. He's spoken in ways that make some of us uncomfortable when it comes to talking about immigrants. For example, talking about Haitians eating our pets, which wasn't true, or immigrants poisoning our blood, which is a troubling statement that sort of harkens back to another time. So this presidency is different when it comes to immigration. It's a high priority issue, and the tone and the rhetoric is very, very, very tough. And I think that's important in part because it has driven a great deal of fear in the immigrant community in states across the country. In my home state, California, with a large immigrant population that we just heard about from Jens, there's a great deal of fear in the immigrant community, a great deal of concern how this mass deportation campaign might play out, a concern with doing some very basic things like, can I go to church? Can I take my kids to school? Can I go to work? Can I go to the doctors? Can I go to court to take care of whatever business I have in the courthouse, whether it's paying a traffic ticket or getting married? So the fear is quite palpable, and I've attended a number of Know Your Rights sessions and talked to people, and it's quite striking to me how concerned and worried the immigrant community and their citizen family members and friends are at this point in time, and that's something to think about as we try to make sure that immigrants who live in our jurisdictions feel free to contact state officials, state and local officials in terms of conducting whatever business it is they have to conduct with them. Now, I have some predictions about what we'll see in the next 4 years overall. And I know that, day by day, we're seeing new developments, new cases. It's hard to keep up, and I focus a lot of time on just keeping up. Just this week, a great deal of time and attention has been paid to the lawful permanent resident who graduated from Columbia Graduate School, who was a protest leader and has now been placed in removal proceedings. It's a very complicated process. There's a lot of moving parts, but I do think that cases like this we may see more in the future, and we will have to be poised to deal with unexpected things coming up as they affect people in the communities, cause some disruptions in communities, and generate concern in various communities. Now, my predictions are, besides that things are going to be fast moving and changing rapidly, one is I don't think that we're going to see much change in terms of the overall undocumented immigrant population in the United States. As Jen's filled us in, there's roughly 11 million undocumented immigrants who live in this country. The current administration may remove some of them from the country, but I don't think that you're going to see much of a dent in the overall removal rates of undocumented immigrants. And in fact, the current numbers for removals appear to be less if we project them out to the annual figures, to be less than the 400,000 a year that were being removed from the country during the Obama administration. So I don't think that we're going to see much of a change in the undocumented immigrant population absent a significant change in the economy. And that's because undocumented immigration is fueled by the magnet of jobs. And the magnet of jobs in the United States is strong and brings many immigrants to this country. Immigrant workers are critical parts of our U.S. economy, especially in some states. They are in California, where I'm from. So I don't think, unless there's a change to the way that we enforce the prohibition on the employment of undocumented immigrants, I don't think there's going to be much of a change in the undocumented immigrant population. Now, it's slightly different when it comes to my prediction about legal immigration. I think that the Trump administration will take measures that are designed to and will in fact reduce legal migration. President Trump already has suspended refugee admissions. His last year in office, President Biden allowed for the admission of 125,000 refugees. Currently, the Trump administration is projecting for this next fiscal year 0 refugees to be admitted, and has cut funding to the agencies that serve those refugees. The Trump administration also has ended what's called temporary protected status, TPS, for Haitians and Venezuelans. And this kind of relief basically allowed Haitians and Venezuelans who are fleeing turmoil in their homeland to stay here temporarily and to receive work authorization. They're legal residents for the time that their country is designated, but now they're going to be subject to removal. And there's talk of removing TPS for Ukrainians. There's talk of removing TPS for Salvadorans as well. So I think we're going to see a number of steps that reduce the number of legal immigrants to the United States. And in his first term in office, President Trump supported a bill that would have reduced legal immigration to the United States from about 1 million a year to 500,000 a year. And one of the ways that the law would have done that was by reducing family migration. As Jen's told us, family migration is the biggest ingredient to legal immigration to the United States. And President Trump, who's basically said that family migration is unwanted chain migration, in this bill sought to limit it significantly. Now, another prediction I have, undocumented immigration will stay the same probably, absent changes in the economy. Legal immigration may be reduced. I do think that the various measures of the Trump administration will have state and local impacts. When immigration operations go up, our states and localities feel impacts. Examples of that are the immigration raids in the Central Valley of California in early January, which caused disruption in the communities, concern among agricultural growers, and had many people asking questions of what we might expect with the mass deportation campaign endorsed by the Trump administration. Now, the truth is, these operations can have some impact, but in terms of reducing the undocumented immigrant population, will probably have a limited impact. And it's also important to remember that all persons in our community have rights, including rights and protections from certain practices of immigration and customs enforcement. Many community groups and churches have held Know Your Rights workshops for many weeks, informing immigrants of their rights. As Supervisor Alejo mentioned, there's been some very large Know Your Rights workshops down in the Watsonville area. And there are these things called red cards that list rights available to non-citizens that can be kept handy in the event of immigration and customs enforcement knocking at your door. Now, one of the things that many people are interested in, I'm sure this group is as well, is that there's a sort of different place, different role for the federal government and for the state government and for local governments when it comes to immigration. Now, the law is pretty clear in some ways, and it's less clear in others. The law is clear that the U.S. government, the federal government, has the exclusive authority to admit and deport immigrants. States can't decide who to admit and who to deport. Oregon can't decide, for example, not to allow any more Californians to come to Oregon. The Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, is made it clear that it is the federal government that makes the decisions about immigration admissions and deportations. And in that way, when it comes to immigrant admissions and deportations, states play a limited role. At the same time, immigrants live in states and cities across the country, and states and cities enforce laws that protect all residents, including immigrants. You can think of the criminal laws or health and safety laws, all the laws that state and local governments are in charge of passing and enforcing. Now, the Trump administration has sought to enlist state and local governments in its mass deportation campaign. It's sought to enlist state and local governments in apprehending and removing people. And in some ways, I think many would say that the administration has been pressuring state and local governments to assist in deportations. I'll get back to that in a minute. But I do think that that's an important issue, an important sort of tension between some states and the federal government. Now, there are some federal programs that obviously are going to affect state and local residents. Some of them are being talked about, some of them less so. But we don't know, for example, the future of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program and temporary protected status. If recipients in cities across the country lose their legal status, they will lose their work authorization. They'll have to work in the secondary labor market where it's more likely to be exploited and taken advantage of. And I think that we're not quite clear what the impacts will be locally, but if federal programs are reduced in terms of relief for immigrants, we can expect state and local impacts. I think we'll probably see, as we saw in the first Trump administration, a decrease at our universities of foreign students studying. In some ways, that's a loss for the universities, which lose tuition-paying students. And also a loss for our students, domestic students who lose the foreign student presence on their campuses, and gives our domestic students an idea how people in different countries think about their studies, think about the country, and things like that. Federal reduction of refugees and asylum also will affect the composition of our communities across the country. Another sort of aspect of all this is the new federal government, the new Trump administration, may not be quite as committed to protecting the labor rights of undocumented immigrants as previous administrations. President Trump and others in the administration have criticized immigrant labor for taking jobs from U.S. citizens. And in that light, it may be the case that the administration does not take as many efforts as it might to enforce labor protections under federal law. Now, state and local governments play, like I say, a very limited role in terms of immigration. But different states have put themselves in different positions when it comes to the treatment of immigrants. California, for example, has a sanctuary law. It's called the California Values Act, that bars the use of state resources to assist in federal immigration enforcement. There's an exception for certain serious criminal offenders, but generally speaking, state and local police agencies are not supposed to be spending money on helping the federal government enforce the immigration laws. Now, some commentators think that's a very good idea, and it's a good idea to separate local police from federal immigration enforcement. And they would say that immigrants are more likely to trust and cooperate with the police if they are not fearful that local police will end up getting them entangled in removal proceedings. So that there is some reason why we may want to separate federal immigration enforcement from local policing. Now, I think that we'll hear more about that in a later webinar, but it is an important thing to keep in mind, because the criminal justice system is one of the primary ways that the federal government identifies people, non-citizens, for removal from the United States. Now, the Trump administration has expressed its opposition to the California sanctuary law, as well as to all sanctuary laws. And one of the executive orders states that it's designed to eradicate or compel states to assist in immigration enforcement. During the first Trump administration, a lawsuit was filed in California challenging as unconstitutional the California sanctuary law. The claim was that the law interfered with the federal power to regulate immigration. The court, and later a court of appeals, rejected the Trump administration's challenges to the California sanctuary law, and it remains in effect today, and basically limits the ability of state and local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with the federal government. Now, to be fair, other states have very different laws and very different politics and very different approaches. Florida and Texas, for example, are cooperating fully with enthusiasm in federal immigration enforcement and working very closely with the Trump administration. Now, some states are entering into what are known as 287G agreements. Those are agreements between local police agencies and the federal government, and allow the local police agencies to assist in federal immigration enforcement. Such agreements are popular in Florida, which I believe every county in Florida has a 287G agreement with the federal government to assist in immigration enforcement. In contrast, there's no California jurisdiction that has a 287G agreement with the federal government. Now, all of this said, the California sanctuary law and other laws like it really have very limited impacts on federal immigration enforcement. State and local governments simply cannot stop the federal government from its immigration enforcement. As I said, immigration regulation is in the hands of the federal government, and the president has the power to decide how that immigration enforcement power is deployed. Now, my prediction when it comes to this tension and this sort of collaboration in certain instances between the state and federal government is that there will continue to be discussions between the Trump administration and various state leaders about their role in immigration enforcement. I think that the discussions will be most intense when it comes to dealing with so-called sanctuary states. In California, I am sure that Governor Gavin Newsom will hear much about California's lack of cooperation with federal immigration enforcement efforts. And I think there'll be negotiations between the federal government and state sanctuary states over immigration enforcement, including the receipt of federal funds that have nothing to do with immigration. For example, President Trump raised the possibility of restricting disaster funds to California to help in the recovery of the Los Angeles fire zone if California didn't assist in immigration enforcement. I think that Trump administration will continue to press for state assistance when it comes to immigration enforcement. At the same time, I see in many states the continuation of policies that were in place well before the current administration. Some states allow for undocumented immigrants to secure driver's licenses and professional licenses. Some states allow undocumented immigrants to pay in-state fees at public colleges and universities. Some states allow undocumented immigrants to receive a variety of public benefits. Some jurisdictions limit the inquiry of local police into the immigration status of crime victims, witnesses, and criminal suspects. So I think we'll continue to see some differences among the states in its policies toward immigrants, and some differences among the states on its role of cooperation with the federal government. Now, I do think that all levels of government have a role when it comes to the treatment of immigrants. Both legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants live in our jurisdictions. They're part of our community. And different states have different approaches. In California, the California Attorney General, Rob Bonta, has made it clear that California will protect its immigration and other positions from federal interference. And he's received funding from the legislature to challenge some of the Trump administration's measures on immigration, reproductive rights, and climate change. And I think this tension is likely to continue, and we will have to see where it all ends. Thank you very much, and I want to thank you again for being here today.
Before we conclude the presentation, or excuse me, the webinar today, I wanted to make note again of our upcoming webinar. As the professor alluded to, we will be continuing to dig into these topics, including, but not limited to, just the national landscape as a whole, as well as ongoing litigation. That webinar will be on Wednesday, March 26th from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. We will be sending outreach, so keep an eye for those emails. Additionally, again, this webinar was recorded and it's available for your reference after the meeting. And lastly, I'm going to go ahead and drop Ryan and my emails in the chat. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. And lastly, I realize I said that already, but really lastly this time, we will be addressing questions received in the chat in a summary document after the webinar. And so thank you for those who did provide any questions or comments. We look forward to providing responses to that in a timely manner. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, for spending your morning with us. We hope that you enjoyed the webinar, and we hope to see you in subsequent convenings. Thank you.